My question is kind of a reflective one on modern times. So with the founders and with the development of American history, we see definitely a shift. And I think you both recognized the founders, like for Ben Franklin, for instance, seeing like the error of his ways and going, oh, we should change this. People in America feeling that way. What possibly could be, and I know this is hard because it might be speculative, but what possibly could be the great moral sin that we're not seeing now, or the great moral evil that we're not seeing now, that as society progresses, we might look back at 2026 and go, oh, we probably shouldn't have done this or allowed this. This is not in conjunction or in unison with our principles of liberty. Does that make sense? Because now we can look back as a society that advocates liberty and go, oh, that was an inconsistency. Is there a modern inconsistency?
I think so, and I might make some enemies by saying this, but I think it's pretty obviously abortion. You have the same sort of dynamics involved, right? This class of persons aren't really persons, they're fully human, and so therefore we can treat them differently than we treat other humans. This is the sort of arguments made by enslavers, African Americans, maybe not fully human, certainly not capable of self-governance. They're better off eventually, John C. Calhoun and others argues, as enslaved persons. It's good for them. I think we do a similar thing with respect to abortion, right? A fetus isn't a human being, and so therefore the extent to which we value its life can be discounted vis-a-vis other important values. And there are other important values involved, but I think that's the answer that jumps to my mind. Now, of course, just like with slavery, plenty of people recognize that, or at least believe and are committed to the proposition that this is a grave moral evil that needs to be addressed. So it's not as if all Americans are completely ignorant of this fact. But yeah, I think that's an obvious analogy.
I was just going to add, I'm sure we could all produce things that we would point to and talk about to answer that question. I think that one of the limitations that we have today in trying to do that sort of thing going forward even is the lack of common ground to even kind of settle those sorts of issues in the first place, which is unlike what the founding generation had, I think. You know, I mean, they did have agreement. I mean, we think about our society today, how many people even would really say that natural rights versus positive rights. I mean, natural rights has really taken a back seat and has since the civil rights era, I would say. So we're missing a common ground or a common text to read from in many ways. We're missing the Enlightenment thinking that produces that natural rights ideology. We're also missing, you know, we don't have a consensus in this country. We don't have a common religious framework to operate off of, I would say. And that's not to say that all the founders agreed about religion. You know, they had differences there as well. But I also raised this as a point in bringing us back to thinking about slavery as well, because one of the things I always tell students is in terms of rectifying whatever the immorality, the wrong is, that the solution is embedded in the problem itself. You know, there was a failing here with natural rights ideology applying to the enslaved from the get-go. It took time to say, no, that extends to them as well. And there was an obvious failing by the church to condemn this uniformly. And that became a debate, you know, going forward into the 19th century. But ultimately, it was those two very things that abolitionists relied on, Enlightenment thinking and Christianity, to condemn slavery and finally end this. So that's kind of a roundabout, but.
I appreciate that so much, what you just said. I'm not going to act like I'm not really uncomfortable asking this question. I'm not even really sure how it is a question, but I consider myself, of course, first an American, but I am from South Carolina, and 25 plus years there. I'm really trying not to get emotional all of a sudden. I really appreciate this opportunity for civil discourse about this such a loaded topic. As somebody that has loved ones that are African American, and I'm just so curious. I saw your graph, and I know the importance of African Americans, especially in the South, during that time, and again, leading up to the Civil War especially. How could they have gone about arguing for the abolition to Georgia and South Carolina more? Because I saw your graph also with Virginia, and I know the importance. I'm so curious how it could have been spearheaded quicker, more efficiently, because it's still, I mean, even in 2026, we vacation, we go back home, and it's still, the ancestry, everything is so rich. And I'm sorry to make it, well, I'm not sorry, because it is an emotional topic, but what are your thoughts, both of you, because you've both, talked about this, so.
I appreciate what you said at the beginning. I'm not from South Carolina, but one of my friends in grad school was a South Carolinian, and she had family on,
Yeah.
it was an interracial family, and she was a Pinckney. They were,
Wow.
yeah,
Wow.
and I mean, this is what happens, But, anti-slavery was going to be a really hard sell in South Carolina and Georgia. Georgia is frontier. You've got Florida right next door. Florida is a haven, had been since the Spanish. It's a haven for runaways. It's a very small, new state, so it's very vulnerable. And in South Carolina, slavery is so thoroughly entrenched there, especially in the Low Country. You're talking 90% African slavery. So it's almost unthinkable to get rid of this. So they're really the two holdouts that really don't have a concerted anti-slavery debate about this. Virginia does,
Right.
But and you can only point to a couple people, in South Carolina. Like John Laurens, I think, is the famous one. But he's from a prominent slave-owning family. Laurens had been educated in Britain. He went to school. He had an Enlightenment education in British university system. He got those ideas from British abolitionists. And he comes back and he says, we should raise a military fighting force in South Carolina. And the legislature there goes, absolutely not. And also Laurens is killed. He's killed in 1782. So he's sort of one of these figures like, what if he had lived? What if he had survived the revolution? Could he have been more of a leading voice for South Carolina? It's difficult to say, but it would have been such a hard sell in those places. And of course, there's also the possibility that the other new states could have just said, well, there's only two of you, and there's anti-slavery sentiment elsewhere. We could just force you to do this. But always, the emphasis was on unity. The new republic was so fragile, they kept thinking that we can't risk the disunity and having, South Carolina and Georgia go off in another direction. But which, yeah.
The Dunmore's proclamation,
Yeah.
do you think that helped Virginia? Because it kind of, you had a certain slave population that went to fight for the British. Do you think that something like that made a big difference farther south?
Well, they read that they knew about that proclamation, and it scared them every bit as much, if not more, than the Virginians. And Dunmore's proclamation, by the way, it backfired on him. The idea was we're going to create a two-front war here, and it had the effect in Virginia of driving even more Virginians onto the side of the Patriot cause, because they're like, well, this is what the British are up to. So, so it solidified the move towards revolution for more Virginians. So, but people were very, very wary of all this talk and the revolution in South Carolina because they were so outnumbered there. So, I don't know. That's mine. long-winded. I don't know what Mark.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'll begin by pointing out that you had slavery all over the New World, North and South America. It was ended with a bloody civil war only in Haiti, the United States of America, and one other country. The other countries, Brazil, for instance, managed to end it without a bloody civil war. And so as hard as it is, I think it could have been done if there was, maybe a greater political will, if there was more creative thinking. I almost hate citing the statistic, and I know the numbers aren't exactly right. I used to know the numbers. If you added, and again, I almost apologize to say this, but if you add up the value of enslaved Americans in 1860, I think it's something like $4 billion. And the Civil War destroyed something like $100 billion worth of property. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to say, well, maybe there's a way in which we could have some sort of scheme whereby we emancipate the slaves, compensate the enslavers, and avoid a horrific civil war in which 600,000 Americans died and all sorts of property was destroyed. Again, I'm not saying it would have been an easy task at all, especially with these deep southern states, but the optimist of me says we could have tried harder, right? We could have ended this institution without a bloody civil war. And it's difficult for me to imagine, let's say somehow the Civil War had been averted. I'm pretty sure we wouldn't still have slavery today, right? So I think it could have been done. It's just a question of political will. And as an academic, I'd like to think making good arguments can get us there. I'm not sure, maybe needs more than that.
I was just going to add to that too, Mark, that, it's that the lack of will that's the paramount feature of this. I think that no matter where you were located, all of the founders could have done much, much more to go after slavery. All of them were limited. Even the ones who were anti-slavery or came around to it could have done more in many respects. Jefferson could have done much, much more. Washington, yeah. Oh, but what I was going to say is, what could they have done to act? Is that what you're going to ask?
I was going to say,
yeah.
like, shifting of, industry, more similar to the North, especially when you were talking about the development of the cotton gin. Like, that they have somehow made more of a, I'm talking, like, from an economic perspective, like, worked more with the North and developing more things like the North had. Versus, we all know cotton and just continuing with cotton, it strips the ground and, especially if you're not switching your crop. So you think they could have done something like that?
Well, developing industries was going to take time in the North too. I mean, that was mostly an agricultural society as well. What I was going to throw out there is that if there's a question here about what could they have actually done to circumvent the war, eliminate slavery from the, if there's all this sentiment, and what could you actually do economically speaking? Okay, what does America have a lot of? Land. They could have, you can do reparations in a number of ways, and you can buy out people from having slaves in a number of ways. And the offer of land could have been one of those solutions where now you just doubled the size of the country, you win the war, you double the size, you have an immense territory at your disposal. Now of course you're talking about taking that away from the Indians,
right.
Which is what they do eventually anyway. But they could have given that land away to buy off, to compensate slaveholders for their slaves. And that's what the British did. That's what the British compensated slaveholders in the 19th century to eliminate slavery. It almost bankrupted them, but they did it. And we had that. That's where the money would have been to do that kind of thing.
I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
That's, wow. It really makes you wonder what would have happened. Thank you.
I think we have some more questions over on this side.
Thank you. I got a question regarding presentism. Like how do you address it in your class? There's two things that I do in my class to kind of try and put the kids in the right frame, and I'd like to see what you do. The one thing I do is I talk, like you had said, a grave moral sin. And one of the things I say is that slavery did not become a sin until people started deciding it was a sin. Through human history, it was just the norm. And so it's not until the majority of the people start going, it's wrong, that we now say it was a grave moral sin. And one of the other things I try and do, which was, it seems silly, or it is silly, I guess, but I say to my kids, I'm like, imagine, that 500 years from now, 200 years from now, we figure out that carrots are sentient beings, and they solve all our problems. And everyone then looks back at us and disregards everything we do because we enjoy carrots on our salad. And that's the kind of the frames that I use. I'm just kind of wondering, what do you guys do to kind of try and put them in the mindset of these men and ladies that lived at this time?
I kind of have two modes, and I appreciate this because, part of you wants to say, with students, if you asked them something like, how many of you would oppose slavery and think that this is terrible? I mean, there's not a room in the house that's not going to say, well, of course I think this is awful. And then, of course, it's important to remind them as well, if you had asked this question and, pick a time when slavery was actually around, of course, the number of them who would, depending on where you lived in particular, then the hands would have gone down because, of course, people at that time wouldn't have necessarily thought there's anything wrong with this. So we always have to remind ourselves that the people in the past thought about things differently. At the same time, I also want to remind people that even at that time, there were some people, they were a minority, and it takes time to build this, but there were people around, they were fringe, we have examples of the Germantown Mennonites, we have people in Pennsylvania and elsewhere who were saying this is morally unacceptable. It takes time, but the Quakers do come around and they say, no, slavery is a violent institution. We're a pacifist religion. So it's always important to remind them of, you're not teaching the students to be, you're not holier than thou on the one hand, but it is important to remind them too that there were people around at that time who were standing up and saying, no, this isn't right. And it takes time for that voice to be heard as well. If you're talking about something as a sin, it seems to me that it's either a sin or it's not a sin. It's not like time is going to change that. So that's where I would kind of bring students back around to remind them of those early examples of people who were in a limited capacity saying no to it. One thing that might be interesting to do with some students today to bring out this, if you're going to bring up some issue about sin and thinking about this, and point out if you go to D.C., if you go to Washington, okay, and there's a memorial for Thomas Jefferson that's there. It never has been very well visited, but it's interesting. And again, I don't think that this was designed by anybody. The Jefferson's memorial is actually parallel. It's directly across from the new King Memorial, from Martin Luther King's memorial. They're almost looking in opposition against each other. And there, to me, it's the paradox, it's the contradiction that we can't escape from. But it's also the reminder of King was getting the country back to the right path here of understanding that racism is a sin. And he had a salvific God that intervenes in the world, that is on the side of, the moral arc of the universe pivoting in this direction. Whereas Jefferson's God does not operate like that. Jefferson's God is a distant God. It's this is a removed deity that doesn't intervene in the world. Okay? So it's interesting maybe that might help to point that out with students a little bit, to study those monuments, thinking about that for a minute. And remembering that this dialogue about how to understand this as a sin goes way back.
I appreciate the call for humility, and I usually ask a version of the very first question, what are we missing today? And I threw out a grenade of an answer, but there's all sorts of other possible answers, right? Factory farming of animals and that sort of thing that might come up, and that might really resonate with students, right? Who, I could kind of see that, although I eat meat and I sure enjoy my steak or whatever.
Our final question.
Good morning. My question is for either or both of you, and this is continuing with the idea of sin, the scriptural idea, which states the sins of the fathers will be visited on the children unto the third and fourth generations, which is exactly where we are as a nation. So I'm wondering, and especially the sins of some of the founding fathers, wondering what will it take, now that we have actually elected a black president twice, what will it take to convince black Americans today that this country is no longer a racist country? And is the idea of reparations fair to those of us who had nothing to do with the sins of the fathers?
It's a great question. Nothing bothers me more than when people say nothing has changed in America with respect to race, because it's so obviously false. Lots have changed, right? A lot of things have changed. We have eliminated chattel slavery. That was a really big deal. We have eliminated Jim Crow laws. We have addressed in forceful ways almost every form of overt racial discrimination you could do. It's almost all illegal in any public sort of place. So we've done a lot. We've elected an African American as president, plenty of members of Congress and so forth and so on. So first of all, to remind people of this progress, to stipulate that a lot of work remains. We have not arrived at perfection, and we all should be actively involved in our communities and societies and politics to address remaining evils. One of the things I think is important as well, especially in light of something like the New York Times 1619 Project that just kind of paints all of America as hopelessly racist. I really like going to people like Frederick Douglass and What to the Slave is the 4th of July, and his appeal to the Declaration of Independence as having principles that are critical for America, and we need to live up to these principles, right? King did the same thing. I think this is so much more effective than pretending things haven't changed. They have changed, but they haven't changed enough. So that's what I would emphasize with my students.
The first question that you asked, this is the ongoing work of the civil rights era. And yeah, you can point to any number of victories, and you can point to Obama being elected, and any number of black officials being elected, and I think that we shift pendulums a lot in the country. We're moving away from an emphasis on talking about systemic racism in the last couple of years, probably. In terms of what it would take, for black people to think differently, I couldn't say. I will tell you that it does not help. It does not help to have a cartoon depiction of the Obamas as apes. That is going to reinforce a bad view. That's going to be a reminder to people that, wait a minute, what's going on there? That doesn't help out, but we've also moved a good bit away from sort of the, kind of the peak woke of George Floyd and 2020. I don't think that this is ever going to go away. So I don't really know. I'm kind of stumbling. I don't really know how to answer that first question. But it is one, black conservatives are going to answer this a bit differently. Somebody like a Glenn Lowry is going to say, to answer that question, black Americans need to start looking within, rather than without, For the reparations, that's one of those questions that it cycles around, about every, I don't know how many years we have a debate on reparations in the country. And it never seems to go anywhere. It's so impractical that it never happens, getting into questions about who really, would warrant a reparation, how much are we talking about? It always seems to fizzle out. So that one's just going to be something that kind of comes back around again and again. It's also, I think it's worth noting that in many ways the civil rights movement itself did produce some, I don't know that they're called this exactly, but I don't know what you would say the 1964 Civil Rights Act is other than a form of reparations. Making an inclusive nation, abolishing formal racism, creating opportunities for people. That's a form of reparations. So we have done these things in the past. And it's worth pointing out to people that we have not done exactly what you hear many people saying about reparations, but we have taken forms of them before. It's also interesting to note that there have been limited scale, small scale forms of reparations where they compensated the slaveholders, though, in America's past. The British did this when slavery was abolished in Washington, D.C. They reimbursed the slaveholders there, so very, very limited scale. But it was for the slaveholders, not for the formerly enslaved. So that's always a catch. But there are examples of doing some forms of reparations in America's past.
All right, please give a round of applause for our wonderful panel here.
Join us in falling in love with America again.